COVID-19, of which one has already returned back to work. We have to date have 0 inmates that have COVID-19, and I think that's important at noting. Part of the reason that I believe we've been successful is that we took some very proactive steps from the very beginning, and I would like to share with you some of those steps so that you can understand and see how we look at it, maybe a little bit differently than the outside community, but these are the steps that we've taken. And in addition to that, to preface it, we are a public safety organization that always has contingency plans available for most anything that could potentially happen, and we practice those plans with regularity. So once we heard about COVID-19, very first thing we did, we stopped visitation as of March 7th, and that included families and friends. On March 15th, we then included legal. We minimized our inmate transfers and inmate movement as of March 15th to the extent that the only ones we would accept inmates from were the county jails. As we accepted those inmates immediately went in a 20 to 30-day quarantine, depending on how many people were in those isolation units. We started taking the temperatures of all of our staff. We initiated that on March 16th. We also started denying entrance to anyone symptomatic or with a temperature above 100.4 as of March 16th of this year. In addition to those operations, we implemented some medical guidelines. We actually started monitoring COVID-19 in early February. Our medical leadership started to track it, started monitoring it from when it was Asia and as it moved around the world. But very specifically, as soon as I believe our first cases were in Washington State, we knew that we had to come up with procedures, as we call them, protocols, to ensure that we had redundancy built in our organization and that we could handle no matter what transpired. We also met with the Department of Emergency Management, and we requested PPEs, personal protective equipment, from the Strategic National Stockpile, and that was on the 16th of March. We then started ordering our COVID test kits. They were actually ordered on March 30th, and we were provided with 15 kits though in advance back on March 16th. We also provided regular updates, and they were sent globally to all of our employees via email, and the medical director providing guidelines consistent with CDC and World Health Organization guidelines. In terms of what we did with our staff, how we decided to work within our system, the very first thing would be assessment. And assessments went like this. If anyone were assessed to have a high temperature, a runny nose, dry cough, fever, headache, shortness of breath, we then started having them go through secondary screening. And as that went by, if any of the inmates, or as a matter of fact, any of our staff showed any one of the primary three, what we did is we went to the secondary assessment. Then if we felt the need to, then if there was an inmate, we would remove the inmate from that housing unit and take that inmate into our medical unit and put that inmate on medical observation. If what we would do is stop them right at the door. We initiated temperature checks at our front door, and then for anyone to come in the facility, if you had any of the symptoms, we sent you to a secondary screening, which was also in our front lobby areas. And if anyone presented, we sent them home and told them either they needed to go home and wait at least 72 hours to see if the symptoms subsided, or if not, they needed to go be tested. We continued to move forward with the way we organized our facilities. That, let's just say we had an inmate that was working in our food service operation. We call it culinary. If anyone presented at that time, once again, we would remove that inmate from that area. We would isolate him in our medical observation unit. But then we would also go back look for anyone that's been around that person, staff or inmate, and then we would put that housing unit with all the inmates on medical observation. Medical observation just means that we have additional medical staff that go to the unit versus the inmates going down to the medical department, and then those inmates would be assessed with temperature checks roughly 3 times a day, and look for any other symptoms, and if the inmate indicated that there were any additional symptoms, then we would go on from there, and potentially, if we felt the need to, remove that inmate from the housing unit. But once again, I think it's of note, we have 0 positive tests, and we think that the system is working as well as to be expected. As with any system, of course, it's not perfect, but it seems to have worked. We have it entrenched. Our staff are following the procedures, and our inmates seem to be well equipped to speak up when they believe there's an issue, and we address it. We also, twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, all 3 shifts of staff and inmates have to go through what we call a town hall process. That's when all of our staff are briefed on what's currently going on, where we are, if there's been any suspicion, if there's been any confirmed cases. But we also get that information out and talk to the inmates. The inmates have an opportunity to interact because our wardens are conducting those and our associate wardens. So we're making sure that there's plenty of information out there and available to the inmates. We want our inmates to be part of the process. We've also implemented inmate sanitation teams, and what they do at a minimum 3 times a day go out and sanitize the whole unit. Well, how do they sanitize? We provide with the sanitation chemicals that we have. In addition to that, we were keenly aware that there would be shortages, so what we decided to do was to make our own hand sanitizer. So we have right now, we're making up to 20,000 2-ounce bottles per day. And we're also producing our own masks as well as our own PPE gear, meaning the gowns. We've distributed that around our entire organization, and anyone that wants it, we give it to them, meaning our staff members. The inmates get the hand sanitizer, and we issue that out, and we control it because several of our inmates have decided that they wanted to bring some of it. And so we monitor it, but everyone gets it. So if we have to take the inmates to a unit to where they have to take a shower, we escort those inmates out. But before they leave, we wipe down the showers, and then after they get out, we wipe down those showers again with our sanitation teams, and each of those teams is supervised by by a staff member. So once again, if we have to remove an inmate from a housing unit, not a problem, we'll isolate them. If we have too many inmates, which we haven't had so far, we just isolate that. We would just isolate the housing unit and bring medical staff to them. So the obvious issue is getting the protective equipment, handing out the sanitation equipment, and then monitoring who comes in. The reality of it is our inmates don't have it, and we've been fairly successful, at least in terms of what we can tell. Quite frankly, our staff are the ones that intermix with society in general. Our staff go to Walmart. They go out to eat like everyone else. They go out to gas stations. They're mixing with their families. They have kids. And so we try to prevent any of our issues at our own front gate. And we have a philosophy, when in doubt, keep them out. You're suspected of having anything, you're out. We go above and beyond, but we feel like if we can contain it at our front door, we don't have to worry about it behind our front doors. So I could continue to go on, but I want to know right now if there's any questions or any feedback anybody would want relative to our procedures that we happen to have in place, or I'd be more than happy to continue to go on and talk about what we've done and what we're doing specific to our inmate operations. I could go into our manufacturing, our media involvement, our staffing, whatever anyone wants me to discuss, I'll be more than happy to. The one thing I can't do, of course, is discuss any one particular inmate, as I don't have the ability to research as well as be attentive to this call.
Director, this is Justice Hardesty. One thing I was going to ask you to do, if you could, is address the steps you took regarding inmate communication with family members since this began, and then I'll open this up to commission members, and in order to avoid too much confusion, I'll just call on each commission member to ask any questions on your presentation thus far, or if they have other areas they'd like you to address, identify those and we'll circle back to you.
Yes.
Go ahead, Director.
Yes, sir. What we've done with the inmates is, as soon as we knew we were going to have to cancel visitation, as we knew that would be a portal to allow COVID-19 within our facilities, the very first thing we did was we reached out to the phone company the company that provides us with our communication, and we asked them for several things. The first one, of course, was we would like our inmates to be able to talk more, to be able to provide them with additional phone time. I believe we initially started out with 2 15-minute calls that were free at no charge to the inmates. Then I believe we moved up to 30-minute phone calls within our unit. I will have to go back and revisit the half hour to ensure that it was executed over the entire agency, but I can speak for the 2 15-minute calls that were free. We've also worked out a situation where we reduced the pricing of the calls so that we could still ensure our inmates had access to their families out in the unit and out in the community, and could maintain those ties. We briefed all of our inmates on the phone call situation, and we explained to them that there was a safety measure for them as well to keep COVID-19 out, that we had to disallow visitation. But we also wanted to ensure that they understood under no circumstances did we not want them to have that communication. We believe we've gone above and beyond in ensuring that they have the access. And in addition to that, the inmates were never not authorized to write letters. And of course, they can receive letters. So we spent a lot of time and effort on dealing with that on the very front end. And we started that, I believe, on the 15th of March.
Thank you very much, Director. So again, for process purposes, I'm going to call on each commission member. If you have any questions of the Director for his presentation thus far, fine. If you have other topics that you'd like the Director to address, if you could just identify those, and then we'll give the Director a chance to respond when everybody's finished. If you'll take notes, Director, and I will too, and then we'll circle back and see if anybody has follow-up questions for the Director. Let's begin then with...
Justice Hardesty, before you start again, I think some people have been kicked out. I don't know if you can see that. I just got a message from Senator Canizaro saying she's frozen out of the meeting again.
Okay, we will contact the IT person here and see if we can reopen that. It would be difficult to get a response to ask if anybody else kicked out. If they've been kicked out, they won't be able to respond, but I'll go through the commission members, and then we'll try to get others joined if they've lost connection. Let's begin with Mr. Arascata, who's on the phone. Mr. Arascata, do you have any questions for the Director at this point, or other topics you'd like him to address when we finish this canvas?
I have one question, and I'll defer to you, Justice Hardesty, if it should be answered at the end. Is what are the numbers of tests? How many inmates have been tested for COVID-19? As far as
Go ahead, Director.
Yes, this is Director Daniels. We have 0 tested. As you know, the tests are in very short supply. So we go through the screening process to, number one, determine whether or not they have any of the symptoms. Then number two, if they have to go on to secondary, then we would ask, because we only have 15 pure COVID-19 tests, although we have several, over 1,000 that test for antibodies. But we have medical doctors at all of our facilities and a large-sized nursing staff. So if we needed to actually have have an inmate actually test, we could get that, really have that test available. Okay. So Clear that there's been no test administered, but the front end screening process, no inmates have been deemed needing of a test. Is that right? That's correct. On the front end, we get our inmates primarily from the county jails. They hand off those inmates to us. Those inmates are medically screened the same day upon arrival, and they're put into an intake unit in which they're isolated, in which they will stay there at a minimum of 20 days up to 30 days. And once again, we just have some very significant, robust screening and communication and medical assessment to include often temperature checks and so on, where we're looking and we're asking the inmates about their symptoms.
Thank you. Vice Chair Callaway?
Nothing, sir.
Chief Carpenter, anything at this time?
Nothing at this time, thank you.
Chairman DeRico, anything at this time?
No, sir, thank you.
Judge Freeman?
No, sir, thank you.
Mr. Hicks?
No, thank you.
Mr. Imlay?
Yes, I have a question. In one of the letters we received, it was mentioned that the inmate is getting about every other day 10 to 20 minutes out of their cell. Are the inmates getting any time outside of their cell, or are they self-quarantining in a sense in the cell 24/7?
Okay, I'm not particularly sure of what facility you're addressing, but if it's at our high desert facility, those inmates are, because of the nature of the facility and the security level, those inmates are typically confined to their housing units. And because we initially had some issues with our staff, one of our staff members there, although they didn't work down in the facility, they worked in the administration building, we decided when we were first ensuring that our contingency plans worked, we traced all the staff members that the inmate had contact with, and then we decided to lock those units down. And lockdown just means they're confined to their cells up to 23 hours a day, but they're also entitled for out-of-cell time for recreation, phone calls, and showers. And so when we take them out for showers, we obviously have to escort them to the showers, and we do that, and our staff wear the protective gear. Our view is that chances are, if there's a carrier, it would be our staff. It wouldn't be the inmates, because we know the inmates have been fined, so we take extra precautions that our staff have to wear the mask and the gowns when they're escorting the inmates from their cells to the shower area. And then once again, we sanitize all of our phones and our showers. Each time an inmate goes out and comes back in, we do the same thing over and over, and we provide those inmates with sanitizer that we produce ourselves. And our goal is to ensure that they know they have sanitizer with them, they can use it, and we're going above and beyond in ensuring that we sanitize it to the best of our ability. Sir, I'm wondering if I answered your question, or is there anything else like that?
You did. If
Yes,
I
sir.
follow up, the 5 staff members that tested positive for COVID-19, were they tested through your process, or were they tested outside the facility because of their own concerns?
They were tested outside. Several of them caught symptoms at home, and they had been told that, listen, you may have been exposed because they had a family member or a friend that had it, and they went on their own volition. They reported it just like we asked them to. They called us and said, hey, think I might have a situation. Okay, so go ahead and get tested. In the meantime, when was the last day you were at work? And we're going to do a trace on all those staff members, which we've been fairly successful at doing. Those individuals went to the hospital, explained that they had contact with someone and they're showing some symptoms, and they were ultimately diagnosed as positive.
Thank you.
Ms. Jones-Brady, any questions for the director regarding his presentation thus far?
Yes, Chairman. Thank you. One question I have has to do with resources. I know there have been newspaper articles and so forth regarding potential budget cuts, but how is our NVOC? facility early release policies, notwithstanding your early and aggressive approach to fighting COVID-19, are you contemplating early release policies in furtherance, in case there is more of an outbreak, and in furtherance of criminals generally? And those are tell me.
Thank you for your question. I'll answer the last part first. In terms of are we contemplating release, the realities of it are that our executive branch and our legislature create the public policy that we follow. I don't have the authority except under very limited circumstances to effectuate a release, and even during those times, they're very stringent. Now, having said that, when we talk about the personal protective equipment, as I had mentioned, we are now making up to 20,000 bottles per day of 2 ounces, to the extent to where we have enough that we're now supplying the National Guard that's in charge of the dissemination of resources from the federal government and from state. We're sending quite a bit out, so it's reaching all of our law enforcement agencies as well as our correctional agencies around the state. In terms of PPEs, once again, we decided we would not wait and hope for anyone to help us. We decided to manufacture our own. We are right now in the midst of full production. I'm very proud of our staff. They've done a tremendous job, and they continue to do so. And it's our goal that as we move forward, we are fine. As of right now, we are good. And we're going to help everyone else out. And if anyone taps on our shoulder, one of these government entities, we are going to extend a helping hand as much as we can. So we want to be a part of the community success. We feel very, very good about our ability to change gears and turn it into a manufacturing operation. So I would say right now, we do not have an issue. In the foreseeable future, I will not have an issue, and we're pleased at exactly where we are today. So also, we operate emergency operation centers at all of our facilities. So if there's anything that's COVID related, it is immediately passed on to those emergency operation centers, which are manned 24 hours a day. That information immediately goes to the wardens, the deputy directors, and myself. I call every single day, each and every one of them at all of our facilities. We are very aggressive about it. Myself and my executive staff, which means my deputy directors, we get out to our facilities. My men and women are on the front lines, and myself and my deputy directors, we're down there with them. The other thing that we did, and I think of a special note you should understand, is that once this started, we identified all of our staff as essential. We designated them as essential because part of our response plan that if we have a high incident in any facility in which the staff, large amount of staff would have to go home and self-quarantine, we designated every single person, to include myself, at our central office to be able to go in and backfill at a facility. Those of our staff that are in back that have experience in corrections, we go in and we work corrections positions. I'm a career law enforcement professional, but I started out as a correctional officer, and I can fling keys with the best of them. But I will tell you what, and for those folks that don't have corrections, they can come down and help us make bologna sandwiches and push carts here and there and just assist. So we have redundancy built in our northern and our southern region. We are very confident that we can handle whatever happens here, and the inmates would not suffer. Because we also get out and communicate with our inmates on these town halls twice a week with our wardens and such, they are very aware of what's going on, and they have the opportunity to communicate directly with us. Every time I go out in the field, I actually town hall inmates myself, and I answer their questions very directly and straightforward as possible. The one message I put out, we genuinely empathize with what's happening out there with maybe somebody. Your families and your friends and your concerns, we certainly do. But as it relates to your safety and welfare, all of our facilities have medical facilities literally right across the hall or down the hall, and we can get you the treatment that you need immediately. So, yes, there's quite a bit going on. The communication, though, is key. We communicate very often with our with the other states. We know what they're doing. They know what we're doing. And we're just pleased. And I want to say, again, I'm so proud of the efforts of my staff. They are first-class professionals. A lot of people would have tried to find a way to go home and stay home. My guys are finding reasons how they can come to work and how they can stay at work. And this will be my last comment on this topic, I also want to extend to each and every one of you my heartfelt appreciation to the folks over at the Parole Commission, as well as parole and probation. We are public servants and we work as a team. We spend hours not only do we just put information out, but it's required that no one into our facilities, to include me, I have to go through the protocol of having my temperature checked. If I were to have any issues, I've watched the staff ask staff members, hey, what's going on with that cough? What's going on with this? And then if they have to, say, listen, the nurse will say, we think you may be better off being at home. Well, the staff member may say, well, I feel fine. Say, great. However, our instructions are, when in doubt, keep you out. So you're going to have to go ahead and go home, because we don't want to have a bad day when someone misjudged. Where they are. At least one town hall. When my deputy directors go out, they are tasked with doing the same thing. And my wardens communicate daily with their deputy commissioner of operations, who consistently talks about sticking with our plan. Our plan. It is good. This is the day. Our staff are motivated. They've all accepted the fact that they're public servants, and we're protecting society by keeping these guys safe, because if they decide, our inmates decide that they've had enough, and we've seen that in other states. We're not communicating, we're not considering their needs, then you could potentially have an issue, maybe a disturbance or so on. But we know that we're not just guards. We immerse ourselves with our inmates. We communicate with them regularly. And it's our goal to be a part of the success of what's going on in the state and nationally, in which we can certainly look at successes. So I address the mental health issues, the programming, and the enforcement of our protocols. My guys are sworn. I'm not telling you they're perfect, but they're sworn. And we have every expectation that, as you would in the military, you follow orders the way that we describe them. Because of the human element, on occasion, we have someone forget or choose not to follow it, but we deal with that in a method consistent with any other violation of our rules.
Questions or follow-up subjects you'd like the director to address?
Yeah, first I just have a quick comment. It seems like the web feed has crashed. People are reporting that they're not able to access the website, so if you could share that with your technical staff, that would be helpful so that the public can continue to participate. And my question is, my question is similar to Dr. Salisbury's, but I'm curious about the communication to the inmates about keeping them informed, the status, the update as we learn more as a society around this pandemic, and then how are they able to communicate with you, Director Daniels, and the staff as they have concerns about their own ability to protect themselves. We understand that you've got the hand sanitizer, but are there any other mechanisms in place for them to be able to take some responsibility for that?
Communicate with me directly, and many have chosen to do so through the inmate grievance process. Any inmate at any given time can send a question or address the concerns directly with me through their executive teams. Previously, we are not locking our inmates up and just forgetting about them. We are in the unit, and think about this. Each inmate is able to come out and talk to an executive staff member twice a week. Twice a week they have access to the wardens and the associate wardens. That is mandatory. That's something that I instituted. My deputy director over operations ensures it. And we get out and we talk. You got to understand, this benefits us in a great way to communicate. This is a profession. And we know when we're dealing with humans, you have to communicate. You have to ensure they understand what's going on. Many of them also, though, have access to television. They watch CNN and anyone else that they want to watch. They have the availability to see what's going on in the rest of the world. As a matter of fact, when I was out at McClure last week, they were trying to watch the show and didn't want to listen to me initially. We had to cut the TV off so I could address their issues. Our inmates are well informed. Is it perfect? No. That's something that happens with your basic loss of liberty to some extent. But I want an informed workforce, and I want an informed inmate teams. As a matter of fact, we're struggling with so many inmates wanting to be on our sanitation teams. We're having to say, no, we got enough right now. We'll rotate you in. They feel like they're part of a team. They're very concerned about their loved ones on the outside, but we think that the additional phone calls went a long way, and they've expressed appreciation for it. So, once again, I can't offer you perfection, but I can certainly assure you that my teams out in the field, they execute our contingency plans, and one of it is, at anything, is over-communication. I enjoy it, my staff appreciate it, and the inmates appreciate it. So I hope I answered the spirit of your question, but I'd be more than willing to go into it a little bit further if you require.
Thank you.
Did that cover it, Mr. Story, to this point?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Dr. Tyler Garner?
Good morning. I just have 3 quick questions. One, Director Daniels, is there a role that the commission can play in supporting your efforts? 2, if we should receive inquiries regarding these issues, is there a statement or information you would hope that we would provide or respond? And then 3rd, there's a reference in the ACLU letter regarding co-pays for seeking medical care. Can you tell us a little more about that and what the status may be?
Yes, let me start with the co-pays. For the duration of this COVID-19 emergency response, we have waived all co-pays, so the inmates aren't paying those. Number one, it's not the right thing to do. You can't pick and choose if you get sick, so we're waiving all of that. And I would suspect we're not hearing too many concerns about it, as the inmates appear to be pretty happy about that. Secondly, in terms of information, if you would like, Dr. Tyler, I will be more than happy to send you some fact sheets. It would be the same fact sheets that we have on our website. We have a lot of information on our external website, as well as Facebook. Matter of fact, you will find yourself deluged with information on our website. We're telling everybody on the planet what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and we want you to know. Information is key. We're in the human business. We're in the human being business. Humans need to be informed, and they want to be informed, or they will create their own narrative. Since we've spent a lot of time and effort, we're seeing very little grumblings of that nature. But yes, I will send you some information very specific to what we're doing, and I really appreciate you reaching out and asking if there was anything you could do. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, and thank you for your efforts.
Yes, ma'am.
Assemblywoman Nguyen?
Hi there. Thank you for taking the time to answer some questions. I have a list, so bear with me. A lot of it has been answered, but I just kind of want to back up. So am I clear in understanding that the entire Department of Corrections has 15 tests? Is that correct?
No. Well, we have 15 that identify the antibody. So that would be basically, if you got the antibody, then we can move you on to get the actual test. That's how we can I apologize if I don't have the medical training. I'm an administrator, but I'm not medical, so if I said something inaccurately, it certainly wasn't with intent. So, but
no, I'm just curious. And then of those 1,000 antibody tests, how many of those have been administered?
We haven't had any, as we haven't had any inmates get to that level to where we would have to give that test.
Okay. And then as we all hopefully know, there are a lot of people that could be carriers, and you had indicated that I think 5 employees
Yeah.
had tested positive of their own testing. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so of those 5 individuals, were they all at different facilities throughout NDOC, or were they all at one facility?
They were all at different facilities.
And then do we have any kind of, or does the department have any kind of plan to, I guess, track and trace those people and the contact that they've had within those particular facilities?
Yes, ma'am, that's a part of our contingency plan, and for anyone that had any contact with any of those staff members, we traced every single one of them. And we have
Okay.
and we have the ability, in many respects, to go back and even look on camera to see where a person has been, what's going on. Now, the vast majority of those staff, though, never even made, there's only 5. Several of those staff members never made it into the facility. They were out, they went out of state. As a matter of fact, 3 contact. So he says, okay, well, let your medical provider know and get tested. They did, and that's how 3 of them we found out. The other 2 were actually at the job. One was in an administrative area, and the other one was in our culinary area, and they had contact with very limited staff. But we tracked down every single one of them, and then with every single one of them, regardless of whether they had any signs or whatever, we sent them home. And we asked them to do the same training, or if they didn't have any symptoms, I believe we went with, initially we started out with 14 days of symptoms. And so you had to stay out 14 whether you had symptoms or not, because our goal was, once again, when in doubt, keep them out. And we believe we've been so aggressive at that. We've been fortunate. Now, that's not to say tomorrow we won't have any, but even if we did have an active situation with an inmate, you can rest assured that would be my top priority. I don't want my entire workforce or the inmates getting sick and passing it on to one another. So I'm pretty pleased, though, with what we put in place. Unlike some places, or we have a paramilitary organization, our staff are pretty good at following orders. Once again, I cannot, under any circumstances, indicate to you that we're perfect and our system's perfect. But I can tell you, though, that we're excited about being able to manage this. It's a challenge, and the 5 men and women of the Nevada Department of Corrections have stepped up, in my opinion, in a largely appropriate way. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
It does. I guess obviously I have concerns because so many people cannot show symptoms but could be carriers. So you could have individuals, that are potentially carriers and infecting your more vulnerable populations. Do you have like a plan in place to protect those, more at-risk inmates that are currently incarcerated?
Okay. If you're just elderly in and of itself, you'll stay with the same people you've been with. However, we do have a medical unit up at one of our northern facilities, and we, for the most part, treat that as a medical center, even though it's not a hospital by any stretch. And we have basically, we take care of our inmates that have been in surgery, our inmates, and doctors that service those inmates. That's at our Northern Nevada Corrections Center. I've been there myself. We have plenty of units that, depending on the status of an inmate, but we keep those inmates separate from the other inmates, and we keep a lot of medical staff there. And when we have to, of course, we would escort those inmates outside of secure confines and take them to a local hospital. But in many respects, those would be some of the inmates that would have issues anyway. And unfortunately, a lot of guys have hurt themselves over the years. They haven't taken care of their bodies. So we end up in a situation where we're still having to provide, in many respects, treatment for chronic illnesses and convalescence in some respects. But once again, our staff we have a heavy contingent of nursing staff and medical doctors up at those facilities. And of course, if any inmate voices, listen, I think I'm having an issue, I'm having this or that, we keep an eye on them. I don't believe, and I can't speak for everyone, but I will tell you the vast majority of our inmates know that we're approachable, and we want to know what your issues are so we can get ahead of it.
Thank you. And this kind of goes, I know that we have a lack of, PPEs like across the state, at all, like, hospitals and home health care. Are you having that same kind of a depletion in your resources for your supply of PPEs? Like, are your employees able to protect themselves as they're, in their, they're the ones that are actually out in the community and coming back into the thing? Are they protected with like face masks or N95s or any of that type of like protocol?
As if we were to have somebody that we knew was positive, those staff in that unit, meaning our isolation units, would wear N95s. However, I thought maybe I did a poor job earlier. We are manufacturing our own sanitizer, our own mask, and our own PPE gear. And we've issued that to our staff. Once again, we see there's a strong likelihood if there's a transmission of this virus, it would be from a staff member, as you had indicated, that's out in the community, that would bring it back. So we go through the protocols that are in our front entrances, and we make staff go through screening, and when in doubt, we keep them out. But we now manufacture all of our PPE gear to the extent that now we're now helping out medical centers, nursing homes, whomever needs it, we help them out if they're a part of the public in general. And it's our goal to run these operations as to full capacity to be able to help the citizens of this great state.
And then just finally, you indicated, we all had the opportunity to review some of the submitted documentations from public comment, as well as those things that were agendized prior, including the SAFER plan. Do you have any concerns with that plan? And if it was something that was to be implemented in our state, would it be something that we are equipped to handle or incorporate with our existing plans?
First of all, thank you for your question. Ma'am, I am going to have to indicate that I am not familiar enough with the SAFER plan to comment on it. And my inmates, that's personal to me, and I've ensured that my executive team and my wardens are out and about. And although I see a lot of information that comes out, for instance, from the CDC, the World Health Organization, our public health system here in Nevada, I am not familiar enough with the provisions of the plan to either endorse or comment on any particular portion. However, if you would happen to have an individual question about a certain facet of it, please let me know and I'll do my best to answer your question.
I was just curious about it because it was something that I wasn't obviously familiar with until it was agendized on this meeting. But I believe Justice Hardesty had placed it on the thing, so I was curious about that. What was I going to say? I think some of my other questions have already been. Do you see any concerns? I know that you do have some authority to release people that you either think are at risk or have health problems via house arrest. Is that incorporated into your COVID-19 plan?
Actually, when you were to look at the actual statutes that govern my authority to release, you will find that number one, it's very limited. And there are a lot of caveats in each particular category. My position is this: I'm a public servant. I'll be more than happy to execute anything that the legislature and or the governor decides that will be our new public policy. If there's a change, I will work very closely with my partners over at the Parole Commission as well as parole and probation. And once again, I'm a public servant, and I look forward to continuing my role in this COVID-19 atmosphere.
And I'm sorry, one last question. Have you been meeting on a regular basis with either local health authorities or hospitals to, to develop, the plan that you've come into place to protect, not only the inmates, but your staff that are in there?
I have not, because I have a medical director who's at the deputy director level, and he is tied in 100% with federal, state, local, and regional medical health people, and he has a very talented staff. He's contributed greatly in helping us work on our medical plan and how we deal with the inmates, and I'm very, very happy with his efforts, as well as my chief of nursing. These people are just extraordinary. So, no, they attend all the meetings, and they advise. Me.
Any questions that you might have?
Hi, I think my questions were mostly related to the paper program, but it sounds like it might be better to kind of discuss that under that meeting agenda item, because I think my questions were in line with the Assemblywoman as to the ability and feasibility for us to implement that, but maybe it would be better to ask those questions during that portion of the agenda. And I think everything else I had was answered.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Pickard, I understood you might have left the meeting. If you're there, I want to extend you the opportunity to ask any questions. If not, we'll move on. Are you there, Senator Pickard? All right, well, thank you. I have some follow-up questions, Director, before we ask you to, or before I ask Chief Carpenter to make her presentation. So if I could, I'll just ask you these one at a time, and you don't have to go into a lot of discussion, but I think it will help clarify some of the issues that have been raised. The first question that I wanted to clarify is the preparation or the manufacturing, probably a poor word, of the protective equipment inside the prison. I get the sanitizers, but are you satisfied that you are able to generate from materials available sufficient N95 masks, gowns for your staff members, alternative masks, and protective type masks that we oftentimes unfortunately see in the news?
Thank you for your question. First of all, we do not manufacture N95s. We don't have the capability and the technical specs to be able to manufacture them, at least not at this time. So we don't manufacture them. However, for the other types of masks, and I think it's been for the most part noted that the purpose for wearing the mask is to prevent us from pouring it out, not from keeping it from coming in to each of us as an individual. In terms of our gowns and so on, yes, we can. Our goal is to supply the state, quite frankly. We have a very ambitious goal, but there's a need, and there's nothing better than to be able to have my staff focus on taking care of the folks in our state. And they're amped up. Once again, 20,000 bottle per day capacity for our hand sanitizer. And I don't recall how many hundreds or thousands of gowns that we're making per day, but it's a substantial number. And as the time goes by, we will certainly be able to move forward with what we're trying to accomplish. Oh, you know what? As a matter of fact, I do have my daily total for the gowns. We can produce 500 per day. And relative to our mask, we're producing between 2,000 and 2,500 per day. So we like those odds. And once again, we're calling people. Do you need some help? How are you doing? Let's funnel it all through the National Guard. That's General Barry and his team. And listen, man, you keep dialing them up. We'll keep sending them your way while keeping our staff and inmates safe.
Great. The other question that I wanted to pose,
Mr. Hicks,
Here.
Mr. Imlay,
Here.
Ms. Jones Brady,
Present.
Mr. Logan,
Here.
Mr. Marsh, Mr. McCormick, Ms. Mull,
Present.
Dr. Neighbors, Mr. Ponder,
Present.
Dr. Salisbury,
Present.
Mr. Story, Dr. Tyler Gardner, present, still present. Assemblywoman Nguyen,
Present, but the public feed is still not up.
okay, so let me finish taking roll and then we'll take, that's why we'll take it one step at a time. Thank you, though. I appreciate you everyone keep me updated about what the status is. Senator Canzaro? So did I hear somebody say they were here? Was that Dr. Neighbors?
Yes, I'm here now. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, we're going to work on the feed, to make sure that we're backing with the public, and we'll keep you updated, so just to make sure we have, who we have here. Thank you for bearing with us.
Minutes. Let's just take a couple minutes to wait for Jason to try to restore the feed. Let's go ahead. Okay. All right, let's reconvene. Assemblywoman Nguyen, if you're getting communications from people that they still haven't received connection to the live stream, or if you're notified that they are able to participate, could you let me know, or let Ms. Gonzalez know?
I can, and there's that chat feature. I don't know if anyone sees it, if you have it on a computer, but I can always communicate that way so I don't have to interrupt. Do you have that, Victoria?
I don't have that from where we are meeting, but
okay.
I'll send you.
Sounds good, thank you.
Thank you.
In the interest of everyone's time, though, I did want to address a couple of more points with Director Daniels, but I wanted to give him an opportunity to conclude his remarks, at least for now, and then get to Chief Carpenter, Chief. Director, anything further you'd like to comment about after you've had a chance to think about all that's been said up to this point?
No, Your Honor, I really appreciate the questions. I thought there were some very good questions. But I also had an opportunity to speak about what I believe is the success so far of my department. And I can't talk enough about the talent that I have within my department, in spite of the fact that, as with any public organization, having more staff would be nice, and having a lot more money would be better. Nonetheless, I appreciate what you and this team is doing. You guys are doing one heck of a job. I appreciate it. I'm new to the state, but I like how each and every one of you work. You're very considerate and very thoughtful. And once again, even though I've said it before, we work very well with our corrections and other law enforcement agencies. But my buddies over here and the parole commission, as well as parole and probation, really make all of this work. And I just really appreciate this opportunity. So that's it for me right now, unless there are further questions.
Yeah, I have a couple of quick ones. First off, as you saw in the public comment, some of the public comment raised questions that were specific about specific inmates. Do I understand and do I have your assurances that you're going to investigate those inquiries about those specific inmates?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we're taking notes and we have a copy of everything. So if there are any allegations or any questions, we will answer each and every one, as long as it's not a breach of our security protocol.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to comment to the commission publicly. I just want to know that now that these individual issues or situations have been called to your attention, that I believe, based on our previous conversations, if this was brought to your attention, you would investigate it, and I just wanted confirmation.
That's absolutely, and look forward to researching the questions and providing an appropriate answer.
Great, thanks. And then the other issue that I wanted to raise with you, and you don't have to go into this in great detail because I'm going to ask Chief Carpenter this. You were asked whether or not you've been contemplating early releases of inmates, and you responded in part by pointing out the statutory constraints that limit your ability to consider early releases. And I'm assuming that you were referring to NRS 209.3925, correct?
Yes.
And when you indicated that there are some not only conditions, but that place limitations on you, some of those conditions ask you to project whether or not somebody's going to die within 12 months, right?
Yes, sir.
The other issue is insofar as you're being able to release what we would call elderly people who are, let's say, over 65 and at risk for this disease. Do you have any alternative under the current statutes for just that category of people?
No, Chief. That's it, no.
Okay. You were also asked about what the commission might be able to do to assist you. Do you think it would be helpful if there were some alternatives that might be provided to you and to your teammates through the Pardons Board?
I'm fully prepared to work with the Pardons Board and, quite frankly, anyone else. In terms of public policy, of course, I don't have that latitude. But if the Pardon Board, and I don't want to speak for them, but I mean they have statutory authority to do certain things, and I would certainly consider and execute any legal or anything that I could possibly do to assist in moving public policy forward. That's obviously at the will of whatever the governor wants, as well as the legislature.
And then finally, I'm notified that Mr. Ponder has a final question. I won't say final, but a question. Mr. Ponder, I'll give you a chance to pose your question, and then we'll move on to Chief Carpenter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And this is for the director. And again, thank you so much for your leadership. Would it be possible, Director Daniels, if members of the commission, if we follow 100% protocol, because I'm very grateful for the town hall meetings that you have, which is staff, excellent job. you indicated you had town hall meetings with the inmates as well. If members of the commission who follow protocol and tested and safety and security facility, would it be possible for us to be able to attend one of those town hall meetings so that we can hear from the inmates ourselves?
Absolutely, but I would have to obviously curtail that to the extent to where none of you could be within 6 feet of my inmate, as I don't want any of you passing that on to my inmate. And but no, absolutely. I'll even go out with you. We can go out and town hall a couple of housing units and go on from there.
That would be perfect. Thank you so much.
All right.
Director Daniels, yes?
This is John Arascata. The director brought up a point of the social distancing of 6 feet, and no one's really asked that question. Are they able to accomplish that within the prison setting, or are they doing taking any type of measures to have any type of social distancing within the institutions?
No, I explained previously that we keep our inmates together, so if you're assigned to a unit, you stay with those inmates. But because of how close our inmates are housed together and that they have to eat together and move together, it's literally impossible for that to happen. And so obviously that's a recommendation. Obviously it will start out with CDC and moved on to the states. We believe that it's a very, very good idea when possible. It is not possible currently in our facilities.
Thank you for answering that. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Director Daniels. I want to join with the members of the commission that have expressed their appreciation for your proactive approach and the work that you and your staff have done. And I especially want to thank you as chair of the commission for making yourself available to provide this information and to respond to questions that have been posed to you by commission members. I really sincerely appreciate your public service to the state at this important time, and we appreciate all your hard work. And I would hope that you would convey to your staff the thanks and appreciation of the Sentencing Commission for all that you've accomplished to date. If I could ask Chief Carpenter now to make her comments and presentation, and then we'll have some additional questions or go through the same process concerning the Chief's remarks. Chief Carpenter?
Hello, good afternoon now. I am Ann Carpenter with the Department of Public Safety, the Chief of Division of Prone Probation. And since Prone Probation deals with the Department of Corrections, the courts, the judges, and allied agencies, the beginning of the COVID-19 issue was extremely overwhelming for our division and for our department. Questions like, how do we keep our employees safe? How do we keep our parole and probation population safe? And how do we accomplish our mission and goals and keep that 6-foot distance? We had daily, if not hourly, meetings to discuss parole and probation's current processes. We were inundated with information from all areas. And of course, as the world learned more about COVID, parole and probation had to continually keep up and adapt to this evolving crisis. After Governor Sisolak's closure of state buildings, we closed all of our buildings to the public and did not allow parole and probation's supervised population to complete their monthly reporting. But this led to other questions, such as, who do we consider public? Were our parolees and probationers considered public? What do we do with them if they can no longer come into our buildings? And how did parole and probation work with the Department of Corrections regarding inmate and parole drop-off to parole and probation buildings, and work with the district courts with individuals who were sentenced to probation every day? And what about parole board hearings? How did we handle them? So we worked very, very closely with the Department of Corrections, the district courts, and the parole board, and quickly changed our processes to meet the new demand. We continue to complete orientation for the newly released parolees and the newly sentenced probationers. And because of social distancing requirements, parole and probation officers began completing more field work instead of being in the office. Communication, I have to say, communication between NDOC Director Daniels and Parole Board Chairman Dorico and I, we speak all the time. Whether we discussed how to handle transportation issues or the possible release of inmates or revamping some of PNP and the parole board's processes to be in line with the new COVID-19 guidelines, we are committed in our partnership and frequent communications. And because of this, we've solved many issues that have arisen. Communication with our employees has been frequent, but it's also been challenging. We emailed employees often, updating them on how to respond in this time frame. We also began using technology like WhatsApp to continually update our employees with information. DPS leadership also meets daily to discuss the COVID impact. However, as we all know, the information on COVID has been overwhelming and sometimes contradictory. And it's almost been, we've been on information overload, as we've got discussed, as the director discussed. We've had several challenges, and throughout this unprecedented time, there have been a myriad of challenges that the division has faced, such as the protection of our employees with the lack of protective equipment, protection of our supervised population, and changing our processes statewide, and the fear of the unknown. That's probably been the biggest. Protection of our employees. As the crisis unfolded, everyone in the medical field, law enforcement, and every other essential position quickly realized that there just wasn't enough PPE or personal protective equipment to provide to our employees. Gloves, masks, and sanitizer, things that we took for granted, were unavailable, and after this, maybe NDOC director will share with us. This created uncertainty, panic, and concern on how to accomplish our jobs without contracting COVID. Although we as a state united did our best to obtain this needed equipment, the equipment was not timely and there was not enough for all of our employees. It goes to protection of our supervised population. Although social distancing and proper PPE were concerning, we were also concerned about the individuals with whom we supervise. How are they handling it at home? Did they lose their jobs? Are they worried about money, food, paying their bills? And how can the division help them through this crisis? Their mental health and well-being is also our concern. Essential versus non-essential employees. These became words that were rarely used in our lexicon, but were now used freely. And in many conversations, the definition of these words became crucial in the first days and weeks. As law enforcement officers and civilians who provide courts with pre-sentence investigation reports, we were all considered essential. We have statutory obligations to our communities and to our parolees and probationers, but we also need to provide these services in the safest manner possible to our employees, which led to child care issues. When the schools closed across the state, that created more anxiety for our employees. How did essential workers who had child care needs balance work and home life? The Nevada Revised Statute provided guidance. However, it did not provide a black and white answer. Therefore, we worked closely with our human resources personnel to ensure that we accommodated those employees on a case-by-case basis. Work at home or telework were also words that were unfamiliar, but now have taken on a whole new meaning. How do police officers work from home? How does a pre-sentence investigator interview a defendant and write reports from home? What about personally identifiable information, or PII? We found out that the division had a lack of equipment and connectivity throughout the state. In the urban areas, we overcame these challenges fairly quickly. However, in some of the rural areas, overcoming the limited technological resources was a bit more challenging. Another challenge was managing employees' emotions. Each employee handled this information differently, and each employee's needs were different. Also, inconsistencies with how allied partners handle certain situations differently throughout the state created more angst and uncertainty amongst our staff. During this time, we've had 3 employees test positive for COVID-19, but it's unknown at this time how many parolees or probationers have tested positive. Some statutory authority. NPP has our statutory authority can be found in NRS chapters 176, 176A, and 213. Our role is to supervise individuals once they are released from NDOC custody or after individuals are sentenced to probation by the district court judges. Once inmates are granted parole, the division is responsible for assisting them in preparing a reentry plan. And once parolees are released from NDOC or individuals are sentenced to probation, then the division is statutorily responsible to ensure this population adheres to their conditions set forth by the parole board or the district court judges. But I think the best part of this is the silver lining. COVID-19 has given us the opportunity to think differently, to ask more questions like, what is critical? What should we be doing? Why do we complete certain tasks in certain ways? Can we accomplish more with what we have if we make changes to our processes or use technologies in ways we haven't even thought about? If anything, this unprecedented time has forced all of us to be creative, to challenge the norms, and to explore the status quo. But parole probation has proven that we can adapt to a rapidly changing situation. We are now operating differently, in some ways more efficiently, and trying to meet the needs of the parolees and probationers with whom we supervise and the communities in which we live. If you have any questions, let me know.
As I did before, I'll go through the members of the commission to see if there's any follow-up questions. But one of the questions that I think comes up, Chief, have you and your partners, Director Daniels and Chairman DeRico, identified individuals that the parole board has granted parole for, but have not been released because of an absence of case plans or because of a limitation on case plans? One of the public comments received, for example, from the Federal Public Defender's Office indicates that there are a number of people that could be immediately released who have already been granted parole by the parole board or the Board of Parole Commissioners. I wonder if you could quantify that and then maybe share with the commission some of the obstacles that exist with respect to effectuating the releases of those individuals.
Okay, so the short answer is yes. So Director Daniels and Chairman DeRico and I have discussed this at length, and my team has put together some subgroups or options if we want to go down this path. On the people that have been granted parole and that are still in custody, at the time that we looked at this on March 27th, there were approximately 200 plus, I think, inmates that are in this group that you're referring to, Justice. But some of the obstacles that we are facing is they may be waiting for an inpatient bed that there's not enough room. They may be waiting for release to go into a hotel or motel that has agreed to take them, but they're just waiting for the bed to be available. It looks like some people are waiting for interstate compact information to come through. Sometimes the investigation is pending, whether we're waiting for a pre-parole investigation to be completed and to make sure that the plan is viable. There's also people in custody waiting because of extraditable warrants. Some have ICE holds, and some are sex offenders that they're waiting to see if there's any housing. So those are a few of the challenges we're facing.
Okay, thank you. And are there have you identified with your colleagues certain areas or conditions that could be relaxed in some way if some of these people, not all of them, could otherwise be released, if those small conditions could be addressed?
Yes, we could mandate our staff to complete these investigations in a quicker time frame than they have in the past. And we can try to work with the hotels and motels or wherever that are taking them to try to take them sooner. And we do that anyway, but in this time frame, we would, I guess, reach out and try to make that happen.
Are there a group of inmates? Sometimes it's been stated to other sentencing commissions and to even the advisory commission that inmates will be granted parole, but they purposefully decline to pursue the release options or conditions because they'd rather expire their terms. Do we have a category, or do we have numbers for a category of people like that, or is that part of this 200 plus?
They're included, yes, to answer your question, yes. They are included in these numbers. However, there is in our Nevada Revised statute that states that the parole inmate or future parolee would have to sign paperwork, and if they choose not to, then we we cannot release them. So if that could be relaxed, we could let them out, yes.
Okay. Doing so, though, probably would avoid, or not avoid, but prevent a tail supervision on that individual, right?
Are you asking if they sign their paperwork, they would be released without a parole term?
Yes, ma'am.
I believe they would still have a parole term. The only way they wouldn't have a parole term, in my opinion, and please correct me if I'm wrong, group, is if their inmates' time was commuted by the pardons board, and then they would be done.
Okay. All right, just wanted to clarify that. So if we could, I'd like to call on each commission member to see if they have any further questions for the chief or areas that they'd like the chief to address. Mr. Escada?
None at this time.
Vice Chair Callaway?
No, sir.
Chief Daniels, do you want to ask your colleague any questions?
No. Thank you, Anna.
All right. Chairman DeRico?
No questions.
Mr. Hicks, are you on the phone now?
Yes, I have no questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Emley?
No questions.
Ms. Jones-Brady?
Yes, Chairman, I do have a couple of questions and one comment. In terms of the house issue, I'm really concerned about that, and I'm wondering if, and I didn't hear her address it, but maybe she did and I missed it for the moment, but what about a public-private partnership? You did mention that we're reaching out to hotels and weeklies, but what about other public-private partnerships to get transitional housing? I know that for the COVID-19, I don't know a lot about it, but the city of Vegas and the county are looking at putting some significant money into some space for people, homeless people with COVID-19. And so I'm wondering if those kinds of things can be done. Can we do it in a fashion that also helps us after the fact and now during the COVID crisis with housing? And then I'm wondering too, and I don't know who it is, but someone from the public had approached me and said that there are state buildings that are unoccupied. I don't know anything about that, but has the state done an analysis on buildings it owns and whether or not those can be converted to some kind of transitional housing? The other question I have has to do with roles and the responsibilities between NDOC and DPS as repeat. Who is the responsible for helping with the reentry, the housing and the making sure they have their Medicaid and all of that stuff? Is that an NDOC responsibility or a DPS responsibility? And finally, in some of our cases at the AG's office, we have some habeas cases of people, pending habeas cases, where people have been convicted of sexual assault and first-degree murder in some cases, and they have their habeas petitions pending, and in at least one case, a federal judge has ordered the release of an inmate whose petition is pending, and that federal judge has told us to give her a plan as to how the state is going to supervise that individual. And so we have been working all weekend trying to figure out, is that PNP going to supervise them? Like, we don't know who's going to supervise them. So we have these kind of moving issues right now that I don't have any answers to. And maybe the answer to the last point we have is if someone can just point me to the right person within either NDOC or PNP to help me reach out to them and find so that we can prepare a plan for that federal judge. It's a state habeas petition, but it's a federal habeas petition, but it's a person that's still housed in NDOC. And it's like, 3 of those that are coming up within the next week or so. And then that's all I have.
Okay, so to address your last question, I'm unfamiliar with what you're talking about. However, if somebody is granted any kind of parole at the state level, then our division would handle it. So does that answer any question?
No, it technically would be a pre-habeas petition release. The person is one of the people, for example, currently in court with the possibility of parole, and they're still considering a pre-habeas petition release. We're arguing some of the merits of it, but in the event that an order is issued before, we want to be prepared to be responsive to the federal court.
Okay, I don't know how to answer your fourth question, so let me start with number 1. The housing issue, Parole and Probation works with, throughout the state, with a variety of partners to house people coming out of prison. However, I think that's one of the issues that our state has, is that we don't have enough housing at all. And so I'm hoping that in the future, our state will look into that and explore some different options. The second, the state building idea, I'm not aware of any of that, and I don't know who would be responsible for that. We would love to have more housing. That would be very, very helpful. And 3, the responsibility between NDOC and probation. Statute requires NDOC's case managers, or I don't know if that's the correct term, but some civilians to help people that have been granted parole, the plan, and get their plan, make sure it's viable. Now, P&P steps in when the NDOC case managers are having issues, and so they're doing a good job working together. So they do that in tandem, but I think that the responsibility is NDOC's first. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think on the first, we don't have enough housing and no immediate plan for the housing. These are working well together. And the third, the last one, in terms of who will be supervising these pre-habeas petition people who are being released, who will be supervising those. No answer to that yet. So, thank you. And I don't mean that sarcastically. I haven't been able to figure it out either. So at least maybe, do you have anyone that I'd be able to talk with offline about some of these things, especially the last one that's immediate for us?
Sure, you can call me, no problem.
Thank you.
Mr. Logan, any questions for Chief Carpenter?
No questions, thank you very much.
Mr. Marsh, are you still on the call?
Yeah, I'm on the call. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, Chief Carpenter, first I want to commend you and your agency for all the great work you've been doing. My first question is, has your work slowed down on the intake side as far as preparing reports and meeting with people before they're sentenced?
Yes. I think with the courts, they are only hearing certain cases and so a little bit, but I think it will ramp up once this is over.
It'll probably ramp up exponentially, which is a word we've been a lot recently. On the other side of that, I just wondered, we're going to be probably talking about this later, either commuting or otherwise releasing sort of categories of current prisoners. And I wondered what thought you'd given to the staffing you will need at that time, whether you have sufficient staff if those numbers should go way up.
Okay, so if we're dealing with the pardons board, commuting sentences, is that what you're referring to?
That would be doing it, yes.
Okay, so if and please correct me if I'm wrong, group, but the way I interpret it is that these individuals would be inmates with NDOC, and they would have to go in front of the Pardons Board. So it would be NDOC's personnel completing any kind of reports. Parole and probation only is involved when it's community cases. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
Community
So on
cases. Community cases are anybody that's out of custody. So
Right.
if you're going to commute sentences of people that are in custody, that would be on NDOC.
Okay, but if they were released from custody into the community, that would be your responsibility.
Correct. Correct.
Have you given any thought to how much additional staffing that would require?
Well, it depends. If the Pardons Board commuted the inmate sentences, then they wouldn't have a parole term. Or possibly they wouldn't have a parole term. If they chose to give them parole through Chairman DeRico and they had parole, then I would receive them. So I don't know how many people we would be impacted by, but it would be an impact on our division. Depending.
All right, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about the idea. They might be released with supervision or conditions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. McCormick, are you still on the meeting?
Yes, sir. And I don't have any questions, but I did just email Chief Carpenter the contact of somebody at Buildings and Grounds to check on vacant state buildings with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Ms. Moll, any questions for the chief?
Yes, sir. Chief Carpenter, is there any specific monitoring or extra effort going into people who have been released or on parole and probation with a history of family violence or violence against children? I know from the victims end, we're having a lot of inquiries and issues with victims reaching out or being essentially trapped at home with perpetrators of violence. So is there any extra effort with people with those histories being checked on, or their situations being checked on? And secondly, we received multiple public comment statements regarding sex offenders, and I know in some other states there's been some things around that specifically with COVID. Is there anything particularly as far as reporting that has changed or monitoring that's changed of sex offenders because of the COVID current situation?
Okay, so the first question is checking on those certain individuals. Well, the division has contact standards that we utilize depending on what type of individual we're supervising. So that doesn't go away. So now that even though they're not reporting to our building, our officers are still going out and checking on them like they should. Now, interestingly enough, we've talked about using technology and should we be utilizing maybe this type of technology to check in with our people, and not having to go to their home all the time. So we're talking about different ways to supervise, but they're still being checked on just like they would normally be. And to answer your question about sex offenders, it's the same thing. They're not reporting to the building, but our officers are still going out in the field and checking on them, so that hasn't changed. But with a 6-foot distance, of course.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Neighbors?
Yes, Chief Carpenter, you mentioned that one of the delays in release for some of the people that were eligible were waiting for inpatient deaths. And I was wondering if you could be more specific about what kind of inpatient beds, mental health, substance abuse, and what kind of numbers that might represent.
I don't have a breakdown of inpatient beds on mental health versus drug usage and that sort of thing, but I could possibly look into that with my team if you would like me to get back to you on that. And what was the second?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
And what kind of numbers that represented? So that would probably include both answers to the question if you did that.
It looks like the numbers are less than 35 for the inpatient beds.
Okay. Great.
But that was back in March, and they fluctuate every day, so on average.
Okay.
Chief, this is John.
Thank you.
Is that number 35 for parolees or probationers also?
Oh, this would just be inmates that are in custody that have been granted parole that are waiting to get out.
Okay, so we're not talking about the jail population of
No.
probation.
No.
Would you have those numbers or no?
I do have some numbers, especially from the south. I would have to check with my northern partners.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any further questions, Dr. Neighbors?
No, that was it. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Ponder?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Chair Hardesty. Again, Chief Carpenter, thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for bringing up the question centered around housing, knowing that is a gigantic challenge any other time, and particularly here during this time. My question would be, is parole and probation also taken into consideration other supportive services that folks are going to be being released into consideration? I know that there's organizations like Hope for Prisons and others here in town, right, that are still functioning on a very limited capacity, but again, here to provide whatever supportive services outside the parameters of housing to make sure that they're kind of getting their feet underneath them as best as we possibly can. So what thoughts do you have around that?
Is your question that is parole probation utilizing the resources that are out there in the community? Is that what you're?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so we do that every day, and thank you for your program, because your program is a huge help to this population. So that hasn't changed. I do know that some of the resources have become limited because of the social distancing and because of working from home and that sort of thing, but our people are still getting services, sometimes in a little bit more minimal capacity, but they are still receiving services.
Okay. Glad to know you guys are utilizing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Salisbury?
Hi, Chief Carpenter. Thank you so much again for your leadership and for all of the work that your staff are implementing every day to keep our public safe. Really very much appreciated. Most of my questions really surround a little bit more reducing unnecessary supervision. And so around technical violations and fines and fees, but these are all sort of related into that Reform Alliance Safer Plan. And so I wonder if I need to just hold that question until that agenda item. So I'll leave that to Justice Hardesty.
It might be worthwhile, unless the chief wants to offer an initial response.
I do have just a little bit. Because of this outbreak, we really looked at how we're doing business. And so Chairman Jericho and I worked, about a month ago on technical violations and I'm sure he'll go into it in his presentation, but we have stopped doing certain things if it involved technical violations for parolees. And so, yes, we are definitely looking into all avenues.
And that's for probation as well?
Probation as well. We're not taking people into custody just to take them into custody. There has to be a solid reason, not just a technical violation. And if it is a technical, there better be a very good reason for it.
I have a number of questions to go into detail, but again, I think that's fine to leave it there. Thank you.
Mr. Story?
Yes, thank you, Chief Carpenter. I have two questions. The first question has to do with the numbers that Justice Hardesty had requested at the initial start of your testimony. I missed out on part of it, but could you speak to the entire universe of eligible parolees? And then a breakdown, not of every number, but what's the majority of the category that are awaiting?
And so when you say eligible parolees, what do you mean by that?
I like I said, I missed out on the initial part of your testimony, but I thought there was a number of like 200 plus.
Well, it depends. The numbers vary daily. It just depends. So, on this parole eligibility list, the past parole eligibility list, there could be anywhere from 200 to 400 people on there, and these people are usually waiting. Because they could have an ICE hold, they could have interstate compact issues, they could be sex offenders, they could be waiting for housing, inpatient program, all kinds of different things. So is that answering your question?
That gets to, what's the largest category within that universe of people waiting?
My staff and headquarters has that information, and I can share that with you. I just don't have it with me today.
Yeah, if you would, please. And then a second question, a little bit different. I'm curious as to what technology is being utilized currently for supervision by the department, and are you contemplating any other technology in this current situation?
That's a great question. So the division is utilizing a monitoring system that can supervise the lowest level offender via their phone or via some kind of iPad or whatever. The issue with that is that it costs money, and so it's a voluntary program. If the state could ever pay for something like that, that would free up division resources. So there are different ways that we're looking at supervising this population differently, and we're constantly looking at it. It just depends on money.
Is that the only technology that you're utilizing currently, or are there additional contemplations of other technology that you might deploy because of the situation that we're in currently? I know earlier the question was asked about whether or not you have enough staff to ramp up. One of the other options would be to deploy some kind of technology. So I'm curious, is it just going to be hiring? Is it going to be technology plus additional staff, or what are you contemplating for this surge that may occur?
Because of the situation, the economic situation that we're in, I think it behooves us to look at our current processes and figure out how can we do business with the resources that we have. And so, with that in mind, if I can't recruit or if I can't retain, if I only have limited resources, how can technology help us? So, just in the last month, we've been using this type of technology. The courts have been using certain things. There's Zoom. There's all these applications that we've been utilizing, and so we've been struggling, just like in today's meeting. The connectivity is an issue and that sort of thing. But I think this is a really good way to show the world that we can do things differently. So to kind of come back to your question, those are the things I'd like to explore within the Division of Parole and Probation. How can we supervise people? Can I get phones or something like that, or some kind of technology for my officers to be able to have these types of interactions with their people? And it doesn't have to be face to face. It could be like this. It's a whole new world. And I know people struggle against change and they don't want to look at things like that. They do things a certain way, but I think this is a great time to explore those options, if that answers your question.
Yes, if you could keep us informed, if you develop a plan, that would be helpful.
Great.
Dr. Tyler Gardner, any questions or comments for the chief?
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question, particularly as it relates to the housing and other supportive services. With the social distancing policy driving much of access to those resources online, can you kind of talk us through in a little more detail exactly what that process is or how it looks? So, for example, someone would typically be reporting identified a challenge or concern with utility assistance or SNAP benefits or some of those things. Is there formal coordination with other departments, or how does that process look from the individual's perspective?
Can you clarify your question? Is your question having to do with how Parole and Probation is dealing with assisting our population with getting them the right resources?
Yes. Like, exactly how does it look?
Well, it looks the same in some instances. yes, I mean, there's social distancing, and yes, people are working remotely and all of that, but we still have to go down the same path of ensuring that they have what they need. So it may take longer because people aren't answering the phones or people are inundated with requests and that sort of thing, but we're still going down the same paths that we've always taken, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you're not seeing any challenges with having internet access because much of the services have been driven through an online process now to manage the social distancing. So that's not a challenge or a concern for the population.
I think it's always going to be a challenge and concern with this population because whether some of them are homeless or they have mental illness or they don't have quick access to the internet. But so that I think that's always going to be a segment of the population. But I think several of them do have access.
Perfect. If there's a way that I can partner with you in supporting or addressing the concern, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assemblywoman Nguyen, any questions or comments for the chief?
Yeah, just briefly, we had just discussed it before about some of these house arrest or early release programs or the availability that the Nevada Department of Correction has. But I was looking at them and like I see other programs that it looks like parole and probation like administers or supervises these inmates, like the 305 program or the 317 program or the 298 program or the 184 program. Do you see those as potential like programs that the Nevada Department of Corrections or the Board of Parole Commissioners can also utilize to potentially release inmates, during this pandemic if necessary?
Yes, absolutely. If NDOC and parole and probation, can work together, that would be great. The only caveat is that it may overwhelm the house arrest system with our availability of equipment and the ability for that population to pay.
Okay, and so is that like kind of one of the impediments that you potentially see is like the lack of equipment and lack of, officers, I guess, to respond to those individuals?
I don't think it's a lack of officers per se. I think it really would be if a wave of people were placed on residential confinement. I think that the obstacles could be the lack of equipment and to pay for it, but we could work around those, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Canizaro, any questions or comments?
Nothing for me.
All right, thank you. One additional question, Chief Carpenter. Have you been requested by the governor to supply a estimate of budget cuts for your department, along with, as you know, other agencies have been requested?
I think all state agencies are under the same, fiscal requirements of looking at their budgets and seeing where cuts could be made.
Right. And if you were to make budget cuts to the department's budget of, let's say, 16%, could you describe generally the impact that would have on your ability to supervise parolees and probationers?
Yes. If the division has to make cuts of that amount, many of our programs that we've been so lucky and thankful to have could possibly be cut. And my concern is that this population needs us, and they need housing, and they need resources, and they need us to help them problem solve and teach them skills that they may not have had in the past. And so I think it would be very detrimental.
And then to Assemblywoman Nguyen's question, could you share with other commissioners who might not be as familiar with the numerical programs that the Assemblywoman mentioned, 305, 317, 205, what does it take to get somebody into residential confinement through those programs?
I'd have to look to tell you exactly, but the 305 program I'm most familiar with, which is a DUI program. So if inmates are in for some kind of DUI, they were sentenced to DUI crime, if they serve certain time frames, they could come out on house arrest or electronic monitoring. But they have to meet certain criteria, and same with the 184 and the other programs. They're similar like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, and with respect to, say, for example, the DUI hypothetical, does that program extend to those who have, let's say, a DUI causing substantial bodily injury or DUI causing murder? Or I should say murder, but causing death, excuse me.
I don't recall. I have the statute here somewhere that I could look up for the team if you'd like.
Okay.
I do want to put something out there that just a couple weeks ago, there was a individual who was on the 305 program, and because of COVID, he lost his job and he started drinking again, and so it's a problem for our population that they're struggling.
Right. I think it would be helpful if you could collaborate with Ms. Gonzalez we'll pull up the various statutory provisions and circulate those program alternative statutes to the rest of the commission so that they can see what those alternatives are.
And Assemblywoman Rochelle Wynn, just for information, it's right on their website, so the other members can go onto the website, and it's under the residential confinement, and it kind of goes through each one of the programs that I laid out.
Right. Thank you. All right, thank you, Chief. Let's, unless you had any final remarks at this moment, we'll move on to Chairman Noriko. Thank you, Chief. Chairman Noriko.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here in this opportunity. Before I get started, I wanted to give a big shout out to Dr. Tyler Garner. He seems to be in the news all the time, and all the work and all the extra work that they've been having to put through, and it appears that they're doing an excellent job in moving that forward. And so I just wanted to give a shout out there before we get going. So thank you. You're welcome. With regard to this presentation concerning COVID response, I kind of did mine more of a little bit of a timeline to share with everybody what the parole board has done and how we've kind of moved this along and how it's impacted us. So certainly we call from the governor's initial directive to close all state agencies to the public. We, of course, went along with that. On March the 17th, I made a decision on that particular day to cancel parole violation hearings. And those particular hearings are held in person at either Northern Nevada Correctional Center or at High Desert State Prison. And those are the only hearings that are actually held physically at an institution, and I chose to cancel those for a number of reasons. Number one was I did not feel the need to bring any additional people into that prison setting that could bring in and impact Director Daniels, either his staff or or the inmates that would also be in there if somebody had been exposed somehow and brought something in and start, mass hysteria with COVID. So I canceled those hearings at that point in time, but it gave me an opportunity also immediately after canceling those to get with a lot of the stakeholders that same day and had a conference with the Division of Parole and Probation, the Clark County Deputy DA with the Clark County Public Defender's Office, and to talk and see how could we pull off these hearings instead of doing them in person. How could we do them by video? And I had the same meeting a little bit later the day with the Washoe County Public Defender's Office and State Public Defender's Office and the division as well. And we figured out a way to conduct our parole violation hearings by video from the parole board office. And because these meetings are also, they're open to the public, we kind of found a way that we could, if we needed to, open our lobby only and no further for any supporters, attorneys, anybody that needed to be there, that they could be present and have a voice to do that for those particular hearings. Those parole violation hearings are a little bit different, and we have certain due process rights and time constraints on those. And so we were able to do that and ultimately pulled our first video parole violation hearing off on March 26th in our Las Vegas office to the High Desert State Prison. And all accounts by everybody involved who I followed up with said that it worked well. And so that's something we're looking to move forward on again here later this month as well as next month. Also, let me look here back at my notes. So we've covered that. So one of the big issues that I've been tackling is the parole violators. And back on March 18th, I had a list pulled to see how many parolees who had previously been granted parole were in custody pending a parole violation hearing. And on that particular date, there were 211 individuals that were pending violation proceedings. So after that, and I know that Chief Carpenter had alluded to this as well, I reached out to her and kind of spoke with her about a plan that I thought might be able to work, and we covered this list, and with their blessings as well, I worked with her staff to go through and determine how many of those people on that list were on there for technical violations only. Now, I want to add in there, absconding supervision is a technical violation, but basically those people are just saying that we're not going to be supervised and have taken off from supervision. But we included those people at that point in time as technical violators. So we went through this list, and because we felt comfortable that, number one, the parole board had previously granted these individuals supervision in the past, and thought that they would have the opportunities to be successful, even though they were ultimately arrested for technical violations. After going through those lists with them, and in the spirit of AB 236 and the changes with regard to the parole violations in that particular section, we went through, and as of last Thursday, which would have been April the 9th, we have had 118 warrants quashed, and with another 5 that are pending. And this goes with the collaboration with the division, because certainly those people, once they are being released from custody, they need to go somewhere, and that those individuals will now go back under supervision with the Division of Parole and Probation, to which, like I said, in our collaboration, they agreed and indicated that that would be a good plan that we move forward. I don't want to speak here for Chief Carpenter as well, but I believe also that inmates that may violate here, or we have warrants out. We have many warrants that are outstanding right now, mainly for absconders. But we might have a warrant that's a year, 2 years old, and they might get picked up today or tomorrow. But if those individuals are coming back and they get arrested, and once again, it's not with any new charges, any felonies or any serious charges, domestics, things of that nature, it's my understanding the division is still, with those, they're also recommending to quash the warrants and to continue working and to supervise those individuals. And this was a plan that was developed so that, once again, we can minimize the impact of these individuals being arrested, going into, let's say, Clark County Detention Center, maybe being exposed to something in that institution, and then further moving it along to one of the Department of Corrections facilities. So we have done we have cut down on those, and the violators that we still have remaining on the list are predominantly pending the serious charges, felonies, and or violent related offenses. On March 23rd of this, we did suspend our hearings completely to the public with the governor's directive to close the offices. Our hearings have to be open to the public, and this has put us in a little bit of a pickle, so to speak, here. Because there's a lot of things that go into play when we conduct these hearings. One of the things that the full board's very cognizant of is victims' rights, and especially with Marcy's Law in Section 8A of Article 1 of the state constitution, we have a number of victims that appear before the parole board in our hearings, as well as we have supporters, attorneys, family members, etc., and they all come and they want to have their voice and to say whatever they need, whether it's in support or against a certain individual that has come before the parole board. So, you know, my concern, and I know we're talking about the responses to COVID and how this is affecting, you know, these hearings haven't moved forward here. We've had them suspended, and certainly a concern to mine is down the road, depending on how long this lasts, there's going to be an impact, and we certainly don't want individuals to be incarcerated any longer than they have to. We hear our cases generally 90 days before they are parole eligible, so that gives us time to finalize a grant or a denial, and if it's a grant, then that moves on to the Division of Parole and Probation, and much like Chief Carpenter was talking about, that gives them time to have and approve the release plans of these individuals, and so that a plan can hopefully be in place by the time they hit that parole eligibility date. With that said, back on March 26th of this month, I submitted to the governor's office for review a plan in which essentially would allow the board to still move forward with hearings and consider them all in absentia, and to have all documentation submitted to the board in written format by anybody that needed to, only while our offices are closed to the public. And so I'm still waiting on that to see if that is going to move forward. And so that's kind of the things that we've kind of moved along and progressed from mid-March until now. I know that we've talked a little bit about the SAFER plan, and certainly there's, I know we're going to get into a little bit further into this, and there's some things I think in there that you will see were already instituted and incorporated, and that were outlined in that plan as well. And so with that, I'm open to any questions. Thank you all for being here, and feel free.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm reminded, probably should have been before now, that we've been going at it for quite a while, since 10 o'clock, and except for some interruptions, we haven't taken a break. I'd like to take a 10-minute break. Everybody's close at hand, so let's keep it short. But I will have a break for 10 minutes, and we'll reconvene by canvassing the commission members for any follow-up questions or comments for the chairman of the parole board. So let's just take a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene. And we'll go through the list of commissioners to see if there are any questions for Chairman DeRico. Mr. Escada, any questions for Chairman DeRico?
No questions, and I'd just like to thank the chairman for working with our office through these times.
Thank you. Vice Chair Callaway?
No, Justice Ernest, no questions.
Chief Carpenter?
No questions, thank you.
Director Daniels, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Hicks?
No, thank you.
Mr. Imlay?
No questions.
Ms. Jones-Brady?
No question, thank you.
Mr. Logan?
No questions, thank you, sir.
Mr. Marsh?
No questions.
Mr. McCormick?
No questions, thanks.
Ms. Mull?
No questions. I would like to thank for specifically pointing out that they're making sure martial law is adhered to.
Dr. Nevers? Dr. Nevers, any questions for the chairman?
No questions.
Mr. Ponder?
No questions. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Salisbury?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Story?
No questions, thank you.
Dr. Tyler Gardner?
No questions, thank you.
Assemblywoman Nguyen?
No question, thank you.
Senator Canizaro?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Chair, I did have one follow-up question I had, and it has to do with the plan you delivered to the governor on March 26th for the handling of these hearings. Could you describe to the commission how you will be able to assure victim participation in those newly designed proceedings?
Thank you, Chris Rico, for the record. So, although nothing has been finalized or approved, what we're essentially calling for is, since the offices are closed to the public, we want to do, and we don't want to backlog those hearings as well, it would give us an opportunity to conduct those hearings in absentia. And so, what would be able to happen is, in the proposal, it is for at least 10 days notice for everybody, inmates, victims, supporters, so that they would have that notice and of a hearing date. And then from there, that would give everybody the opportunity to submit any comments or statements that they would like to make and for the board to consider. We would have that 10 days notice. So that way we can still get everything, review everything individually, and move forward and come to a decision in a written format versus oral testimony.
And then, what is the approximate number of folks in the backlog at this point? I know you said this is building, but do you have a general assessment about how many, how big it is right now, and how big it could get?
Mr. Rico, for the record. So right now, even though we have suspended those hearings, we're able to move forward. We can't do certain hearings in absentia right now, and those are cases that come up lower on our risk assessments that we can do. And it's not like everything is stopped 100%. Our in-person hearings have stopped, but we also have the authority to do in absentia hearings on certain cases. What we're looking to do here is conduct those in absentia on those ones that would typically require a hearing. So we have planned to conduct hearings starting again on the 20th of this month, but with that 10-day notification that we had requested in there. Those essentially the hearings that we had tentatively scheduled for the week of the 20th will have to come out if that was to be approved with that 10 days notice. However, we can, we still have the last week of the month. I'm hopeful for that maybe we can get some of those scheduled in absentia and move forward there. We're not going to. We still have a little bit of time to. I guess we have some wiggle room in there, I guess, So there is no impact at this point in time, but certainly as time moves along, then certainly it could impact. Because, for instance, let's say the pre-COVID grants in, let's say, the early March, we would have heard those about 90 days in advance, and they'd have been granted. So the division is working on those release plans right now, and being that we have some time, on our side, we're not impacted greatly right now, and it shouldn't hinder anything moving forward right now. But if that does get passed and approved, that'll certainly help us, and we can be in a place where we should not have any backlog at all.
Great. All right, thank you, Chair. Were there any final comments you wanted to make as part of your presentation?
The only comment I'd like to make is to thank Director Daniels and as well as the Division of Parole and Probation and Chief Carpenter. We've been meeting pretty regularly, even pre-COVID, to make sure that we're all working together. And I want to thank them for their assistance, not only prior to this, but as well as during this COVID crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So, members of the Commission, I'd like to move to Agenda Item 4. And with her consent, I'd like to ask Dr. Salisbury to give us an overview of this, of the SAFER plan and its background, if she doesn't mind. I'm certain that everybody's had a chance to review this as part of the meeting materials, but it is an agenda item and it addresses certain, I'll just characterize it as potentially best practices in this environment, but I'll let Dr. Salisbury take the lead if she wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I don't mind, Justice Hardesty, thank you. So, I actually was the one who added this as an agenda item simply because, for obvious reasons, all of us have been very concerned, including the general public, about what's being done in terms of protecting the community and protecting our incarcerated populations, as well as, of course, the staff who risk their lives daily on behalf of community safety. I want to note that the SAFER plan was developed by the Reform Alliance, which is a national nonprofit organization out of the East Coast. This SAFER plan was informed by many other experts besides those who serve on that nonprofit group, or the foundation, excuse me, including both organizations from both the left and the right side of the political aisle. So I just want to sort of take note that this was well informed both from criminologists who I well respect and psychologists who I well respect and who I know, but also formerly incarcerated people, as well as a number of, again, liberal and conservative groups on both sides of the aisle. The recommendations are, much of them overlap with the ACLU Nevada letter that was submitted for discussion as well today, as well as the discussions that were part of the public comment. I don't have necessarily a plan for how we should go through this. I wanted to make sure that our commission members were aware of this plan. This is the most comprehensive plan that I have seen in terms of the so-called best practices that we would see, besides what we have seen, of course, from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the National Commission on Correctional Health Care. So I know a number of these items have already been addressed, and so I just wonder if we should just go through, generally speaking, the different recommendations that are provided for various organizations that are represented here on this call. I'm open to suggestion with that, Chair Hardesty, but just wanted to sort of say that this is a well-informed plan. It is not certainly a perfect plan, but I think it's one that we have to address in terms of doing our due diligence.
I think the best way to approach this, if we could, since folks have had a chance to look at the plan in advance of the meeting, is to invite any commission members with any comments with respect to the plan and the recommendations that are contained here, and then circle back and see if there is an interest on the part of the commission to recommend some or all of the recommendations that's contained within the plan. So if I may, I'd like to once again canvass the commission members and see if any of you have, at least at this point, questions or comments or criticisms or objections to provisions within the plan that we can all take notes about and consider. We have been going at this, generally speaking, by alphabetical order. I think what I'll do is, with the exception of our legislator members, reverse order, and ask if Dr. Tyler Garner has any comments, suggestions, or observations, and then I'll circle back to our legislative members. Dr. Tyler Garner?
Yes, not at this time.
I'm sorry?
I think I may be having a connection issue. Could you please restate?
Yes, ma'am. I wondered if you had any observations, comments, or criticisms or suggestions with regard to the SAFER plan that was distributed as an informational item under this agenda item.
Not at this time.
All right, thank you, Mr. Story.
Yes, thank you, Chair Hardesty. I just want to point out that by and large, we support the principles that are laid out in the SAFER plan. We definitely agree on a number of those issues, and think that overall, the best approach is to find, when it comes to monitoring folks and looking at alternatives to incarceration, that the technology be the least intrusive, and that people are afforded opportunities to stay in contact with their families, and that their cases are adjudicated in as timely a fashion as possible. So, I look forward to more discussion about this. One question that I would have is that if the commission is to adopt this plan or recommend this plan, I'm curious about implementation and how we would go about doing that. You might have comments to that effect towards the end of the commissioner's comments, but just curious how implementation would occur if we were to recommend this.
Well, I think that's something, thank you, Mr. Story. I think that's something that we do need to talk about if recommended. Let's move on to Mr. Ponder. Mr. Ponder, are you there? Are you still connected?
Yes, I'm still connected. Would you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sir, I'm sorry. We were discussing the draft of the SAFER plan that had been distributed with the meeting materials, and I was soliciting comments from each of the commission members about any comments they had, criticisms, suggestions, or observations.
I did receive it. I have no comment.
Dr. Neighbors?
I don't have any comments at this time, thanks.
Ms. Mull?
My only comment would be on, from a victim's standpoint, on the idea that keeps being repeated of letting people out early if they're high risk, which I understand, but the age, it keeps getting mentioned in some of our public comments about someone a certain age, or and so they should be released early. And I just want to point out that just because someone's older doesn't mean they're still not a threat, or still not able or willing to give use of it, especially when it comes to family violence or violence against children, particularly on some of the sexual offenses or sex offenders. Those in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are very much still able to perpetrate on people, and that doesn't necessarily go away just because they're a certain age. So I just want to make sure this not just if they're a certain age that makes them high risk, therefore they should be released early, is my only.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McCormick?
I don't have any comments necessarily, just like to point out that it appears NDOC has already implemented a number of the recommendations at the beginning of the plan.
Mr. Marsh?
I had the same reaction, which was that I was heartened to hear that some of the recommendations regarding inmates, such as phone contact, waiving co-pays, those type of things are already being implemented. I think where this is going to be difficult is under the current law coming up with a way to review and potentially release the more vulnerable populations, which unfortunately, as one of the other commissioners said, it does include older inmates, also those with health problems. And I think this is where the commission could and should get involved in making recommendations in that area. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Logan?
No further questions or any comments at this time.
I'm sorry, somebody wanted to make a comment and I interrupted them. I apologize after Mr. Marsh's remark.
I just wanted to echo those sentiments and to underscore in particular as it relates to the compassionate release, that there be some attention to the reentry components, particularly the supportive services and other things that would be needed. Should we be at a place where we can undertake that as a strategy, especially given the fact that these are particularly vulnerable populations that are under consideration, so that the impact of things like access to housing, healthcare, food, and things of that nature become significantly more challenging to address given the level of vulnerability.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Jones-Brady?
Yes, thank you. Just to reiterate on the reentry piece, the housing, the health, access to health care, I'm heartened by the plan and that they're already starting to implement certain protocols as to this. However, with the, if we need to really have a good way, if it's not being done, but to make sure that people are getting approved for Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security or what have you before they're released, because if they're vulnerable and they get out and they have no health care, they have no income, then really it's not being very helpful. So the reentry piece of it, the housing, the health care, that we really need to focus, I think, on those aspects of it. The other thing that concerns me a little bit is on the technology. Some of our prisons are in the frontier or rural areas where technology is not always that reliable, and sometimes it's difficult to recruit people to those areas, either for correctional officers or medical providers and that sort of thing. So I think that I'd like to hear from maybe Director Daniels as to what plans they have or how their status is with regard to technology, access to computers, access to telephones, etc. And then that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Emley?
Just a few comments. Some of the things that were mentioned were there's 12,000 inmates currently in the Nevada Department of Corrections, and none have been tested. And we know from the studies and everything else out there that even if you're asymptomatic, you're still contagious during a 15-day period. And We've had 5 staff members test positive of the 2,700 staff members, but they were tested outside. It wasn't a vetting process that they went through at the prison to determine whether they were positive or not. And so that's part of my concern, is that are they actually catching people that are positive, or they're just not symptomatic? And we're quarantining, in a sense, people for 23 hours a day, or for extended periods of time. That's how they're doing the social distancing. And even the director said they're doing as well as can be expected. So from my perspective, it seems like by reducing the population, we're talking about the nonviolent felonies are the ones that are mentioned in the safer plan as well. So we're not talking about violent offenses, but by reducing the number of inmates at NDOC, we're going to be able to have more resources to ensure the safety not only of the inmates but the staff. And so to me, it seems like a safer plan makes perfect sense. We would be releasing the large number of people that are close to being paroled or that have already been granted parole, nonviolent offenders who wouldn't pose a risk to the community, while ensuring the safety of those that remain detained, as well as the staff at NDOC. Those are my comments.
Okay. Let's see, Chairman DeRico, do you have any comment regarding the safer plan, or any of the specific recommendations in there, or are you in a position to do so yet?
I don't have any specific comments with regard to anything there outside of my realm, so to speak, and I already mentioned what we've done with regard to the individuals pending technical violations. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Director Daniels, I know you had expressed or indicated earlier in the meeting and during your presentation you hadn't had a chance to go through this prior to the meeting. Have you since, or would you prefer additional time to study it? Director Daniels, are you still in the meeting?
I'm still in the meeting. As a matter of fact, I did take some time to review the document. I didn't read it all word for word, but I can certainly look at the topic. I have a couple of comments, if that would be okay.
Yes,
number one, the fact that we haven't had a positive test doesn't mean that we're not actively seeking it. We want to find those active people, if they are in there, so that we can sequester them and get them treated. There is no correlation between, in my opinion, this is an opinion, between releasing inmates and enhancing or increasing public safety or increasing the safety of the inmates in the secure confines of my facility. I would actually make the opposite point. If I were to release, let's just pick a number, 500 inmates or 1,000 inmates, where exactly would they go? There is no place to live. There is no food. There are no jobs. Where could they get their medication? Where would they have ready access? Yes, they would have their liberty restored, but to what extent? Exactly what are they going out to? If you were just to casually look around in terms of what's going on out here in Las Vegas, there are no jobs. Most of them happen to be in the public safety arena, but there are no jobs. So exactly what will we be doing in addition to creating another burden for those that are already out there that would have to bring them in and share their food and so on? I highly value liberty, but not to the extent to where we would be creating the public problem, because many of them would go out and reoffend. You don't have any money, you don't have a job, you don't have any place to live. At some point in time, you're going to kick into survival mode. That's certainly not everybody, and I can't give you a percentage, but I can tell you what, there's not just a possibility of recidivism, there's a probability in this current environment. So to call for the release of inmates just for the release of inmates, I don't see the value to society other than creating residual issues with additional crime, a lack of supervision, and I'm not trying to talk for my partners here, and probation and parole commission, but I will share with you, following the logic of just releasing because it would be safer, I would add safer for who? I don't have an issue, and I don't want an issue within the prison. I certainly am very interested in sentencing reform, criminal justice reform, but I think there's a right way, and we can't just seize this as an opportunity. Once again, speaking for myself, can't seize this as an opportunity to further or to hasten sentencing reform or criminal justice reform if we don't have a plan. I would be hard-pressed to get a job if I were to lose mine right now. What would be the chances of success for many of these people? And we just heard from many people here, those resources are scarce to none. So that's my comment. But in terms of looking at the report in general, I looked at most of the topics, and quite frankly, I will tell you, we're actually doing most of those, and we have embraced most of those. But once again, I don't want to make the enemy the perfect or the good. We've done the things that we believe are important, and I believe our statistical analysis is concise. We're making our own sanitizer. We're dealing with cleaning and disinfecting on a regular basis. We've stopped the vast majority of our movement. We've stopped our medical copays and wait lists. We've acquired and are acquiring the appropriate testing equipment, and we have the ability to control who enters our space. So anyway, those are my comments. I would hope those weren't too strong, but I feel a need to share that. What do you do when they're all out? Where exactly do they go? Who monitors them? Who feeds them? Who pays? Who gives them money? Where does all this happen? Just to release people with no plan, I think is harmful. And then on top of that, the victims would have to deal with the fact that many of those folks that got out early would not, in many respects, be supervised. So anyway, that is my comment for now, and I'm available for any further comment.
Okay, thank you, Director. Chief Carpenter, any comments or observations?
Hi, I just have a few comments. First of all, I want to echo everything that Director Daniels eloquently stated. I also wanted to echo the comments of Ms. Mole about the victims. I think that's an important piece that we shouldn't forget. Also, with the technical violations in the SAFER plan, I think that Chrome Probation is doing what we can to do better in this area. And the last thing regarding older individuals, I just want everyone in this group to know that 2 weeks ago, the Nevada Highway Patrol lost a sergeant to someone who committed a crime and he was over 60. And so I won't belabor the point. I just need everyone to understand that sometimes age doesn't matter when it comes to committing a crime. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Arascata, any comments regarding the proposed plan?
Yeah, I just want to circle back to the comments at the very beginning. This is what's been deemed to be best practices by a bipartisan group of individual experts that support this plan, regardless of what side of the aisle they are on. If you want to call pro law enforcement versus pro, the human rights or ACLU side, everyone. It's a safer plan. It's not a best plan, but it is the best practices that are being recommended, not only for our state, but across the country. And I just think we need to keep that in mind. We all have our agendas and we all have our areas that we feel that we're experts in, but this is a document and a suggested plan that has been recommended by a bipartisan group of experts as the best practices to keep our communities as safe as possible.
Mr. Hicks, I don't know if I called on you, and if I didn't, I apologize. Are you still on the phone?
I am, thank you. No apology necessary. I figured you were coming around sooner or later. So I don't have a lot of comments on it. I think it presents good recommendations for all of us to consider in doing our individual roles in this whole criminal justice process. I don't know that a wholesale adoption of everything in there is something I would necessarily advocate for, but I do think there are good recommendations that we need to use, balancing it against, our resources, victims, public safety, and actual threat. I was very pleased to hear, like all of you, about the prison and that there are no reported cases yet, and all the steps that the director has taken. I commend him for that. Likewise, I can report in Washoe County, we have no incidents in our jail, no positive cases, and a significantly reduced jail population, largely in line with some of the recommendations in the SAFER plan. And so, I guess my 2 cents is there are some good recommendations there that all of us should take into consideration in doing our individual roles in trying to balance against other interests that are important to consider.
Assemblywoman Nguyen?
It's Nicole. She had to step and handle court, so she wanted me to let you know that in case you call on her.
Thank you, Senator. Were there any comments or suggestions you had with respect to the SAFER plan at this point?
Yeah, just a few. And some of this is there may be some individuals on the phone who can answer some of the questions. One of the things that I agree with but have sort of a question on is the medical cost and waiver of copays. I don't know what that looks like currently in our prisons and jails, but obviously one of my questions would be what would be the fiscal impact of that if we were to adopt that. If it's not something that we already do, how much of a fiscal impact to the state budget are we looking at? And then sort of along some of the same lines, there were some recommendations to liberalize overtime restrictions and then the sources of supplemental staff. And so kind of in the same vein, what the fiscal impact of that might look like for NDOC and for any of the jails that might be increasing overtime. And then for the supplemental staff, especially with regard to NDOC, because of legislation that was passed last session, and I know they're not in bargaining yet, but there are certainly some parameters for state employees. And I'm just wondering if we see that there might be any issues with recommending those things, and then again, just the fiscal impact of that. So those are maybe more some questions from that angle. And I don't know if it's better to kind of answer some of those. I've got some other things that I wanted to just touch on as well.
Do you mind covering those now?
Sure, yeah, that's totally fine. So in there it also says that there would be alternatives for incarceration for pretrial defendants who have not been adjudicated as a risk to public safety. And so, again, while generally I think we're all of the mindset that if you're not going to be a risk to public safety, if there's not a risk that you're not going to appear for court, we would want to make sure that we're not over-incarcerating pretrial defendants. But I do think, and specifically, and especially because of some new guidelines that exist for pretrial release, I guess what would that mean if we were to adopt that? The language of adjudicated as a risk to public safety, how does that interplay with the current status of the law? And then the alternative, of course, is to utilize house arrest and electronic monitoring. That's the same for, I believe, individuals who are serving sentences in jail and then also released from prison for the house arrest and electronic monitoring portion. And I guess I'm wondering what the capacity is for us to put additional individuals on house arrest or electronic monitoring. That seems to be an ongoing issue, that there aren't enough electronic monitoring devices, there aren't enough house arrest officers. How are we going to be monitoring people in the field while keeping in compliance with additional, I guess, case loads for those officers and those who are supervising them, and how we're going to comply with social distancing and allowing them to do their jobs if we're going to be impacting this. And then I think just some of the more technical pieces of the parameters for release from prison, we're talking about nonviolent offenders. In the suggestions in the SAFER plan, it says anybody within 6 months of release should be immediately released. And so I'm just wondering what other parameters we would be looking at with respect to release from prison. Like what constitutes nonviolent? Are we talking about community sentences? Are we talking about the pardon board sort of taking that over? And I just think a little more clarity from our part, if we're going to be recommending that, would be helpful. The other piece was they talked about a technical violation. So no new crimes were committed. Anybody who was on supervision but had committed a technical violation. I'm just wondering if we would be defining that similar to how we, I think, defined it last session with what constitutes a technical violation. One example I think of is if somebody, for example, was supposed to have no contact with the victim, but then was revoked from probation or parole for having contact with the victim, is that a technical violation? And where we're drawing those distinctions. I think the same questions about elderly and those at risk. Is it just a blanket across the board if you're elderly or at risk? Are we talking about individuals who might be elderly or at risk, but who also fall under the definition of, sex offenders or violent crimes? That would be concerning to me. And then the supervision piece where they want to release everyone from supervision if they've done 3 years or more. I guess my question is just more so, would that be on just a blanket across the board? If you're on supervision for 3 years and you've been compliant, we're going to release you? Would there be some parameters to that? Because some of the individuals who are on longer supervision tend to be folks who are being supervised for a sex offense or for a violent offense. And so I guess I would just want some clarity on that.
Okay, thank you, Senator. All great questions. Let me share with the commission some thoughts I had on not only on this, but also in the context of the Sentencing Commission's authority and statutory duties and responsibilities. I think we need to be mindful that the Sentencing Commission as an entity doesn't really have any authority to compel or adopt regulations that are enforceable on anyone. It is a recommending body. And so, for example, if we thought it was prudent to address on, say, the first major page dealing with recommendations under legal visitation, alternatives to physical visitation, if we thought that recommendation was a prudent thing to do, then we could recommend it, and the person who would be implementing it would be the Department of Corrections. Similarly, with respect to the medical copays, subject to the questions posed by Senator Canizero, that too would be a recommendation, and the entity that would be implementing it would be a combination of the Department of Corrections and the Division of Parole and Probation, who might supervise somebody if they were getting out. There are a number of other questions, good questions the Senator and others have asked that I think probably require some additional information. I mentioned also pre-trial. Those issues involve the sheriffs who supervise those jails and the limited jurisdiction courts who are responsible for making pretrial detention determinations and the district court judges. So I think it's important to gain their input for purposes of recommendations. One thing that the commission could do, if it thought was appropriate, was to recommend either to the governor some action that he take, or to the director, or to Chief Carpenter, or to Director Daniels. But one of the things that I was concerned about has to do with some of the general conversation about releasing inmates, whether it or whether it be those who have existing parole grants that are subject to trying to meet certain conditions, or whether it be in a category of non-violent offenders, so-called, that would be released. Any of those release mechanisms under our Constitution are going to fall within the authority of the Pardons Board. And as you all know, that consists of the Governor, the Attorney General, and the 7 justices on the Supreme Court. So once again, while this Commission's input, suggestions, and ideas would be valuable for consideration by the Pardons Board if it were to convene to consider some of these alternatives, it's still ultimately, as far as I can tell, unless you get into some of the special programs that Assemblyman Nguyen appropriately identified, isn't really going to take place in the absence of some action taken by the Pardons Board. So it seemed to me that one of the things that this Commission could do is urge the Governor to convene the Pardons Board. He is the only one who really can do that as the chair of the Pardons Board. So that might be something that could be recommended today. I do want to also mention that we have a meeting scheduled in 2 weeks on the 29th of April. And with the exception of some aspects of the SAFER plan that people may wish to make a motion about today, we could explore some of the questions that have been raised, get some answers to those and some additional input, and further vet the plan on April the 29th. Looking at the agenda for April 29th, it is primarily to take a look at, I think, Ms. Gonzalez, we have something like 4 or 5 or 6 applications for funding for our implementation programs, and I wanted to have the Commission vet those and make recommendations to pass those on to the Bureau of Justice Assistance so we can begin getting that money into those agencies' hands. But we could certainly continue our discussion and continue to vet some of these matters in the plan, and all of it, of course, as we go forward. So that's sort of my long-winded reaction to all of this. We don't have to take any action on anything today. We could take some action on some of these matters today. We certainly as well could make any other recommendations that the Commission would like to advance. With that said, I want to return back to Dr. Salisbury because I really appreciate her leadership in bringing this forward and give her an opportunity to react to some of the comments that were made, including mine, and then see if she has any additional remarks or suggestions at this point. Dr. Salisbury?
Thank you, Chair. Hardesty appreciated. Yeah, I appreciate the comments that have been made, and this is precisely, what I was hoping. I think we just need to discuss these specific recommendations, particularly for our own context here in Nevada. I wouldn't expect that a plan would wholesale be adopted across the board necessarily without really thinking about our situation in particular, given that we don't have any inmates at this point or incarcerated people who tested positive. Of course, the concern is still there that there may be some who are asymptomatic and still spreading it, and I think it's our responsibility to anticipate a possible outbreak in one of the facilities. I also just want to mention that, I don't want to focus specifically only on NDOC in terms of custody populations, but also remind everyone about the thousands of incarcerated people who are in our local jails and in rural jails as well. So it's my opinion that I think we need to maybe come to some consensus about whether or not we feel like we need to move forward in discussing potentially releasing incarcerated people given the situation that we're in. I don't know that we need to vote on that or take action, but I think I'd like to hear people's sort of reactions about the specific recommendations about releasing folks given our situation in Nevada. I'm personally of the opinion that it would be safer for staff and for inmates to be released, even if they don't have a place necessarily to go, because it gives people more autonomy and freedom of choice. If there's any possible way to give incarcerated people a choice as to whether or not they want to release, I would advocate for that. I think if it's possible to reduce the number of people incarcerated on behalf of the correctional staff at NDOC and our jails, jail facilities, it theoretically should help their staffing and the likelihood of it further spreading. I also am very, very mindful as an expert on offender risk assessment and thinking about the plan and implementing this across the board, what it would really take for NDOC and parole and probation and others to really understand who poses a public safety threat and who doesn't. We do have the Nevada risk assessment tool that both agencies use, and not sure that Las Vegas Metro or other agencies use that tool, but these are going to be some of the questions that I'm anticipating coming up in terms of the level of risk that people pose, and have a number of comments that I'll save for when that discussion does happen. My only other sort of add to the SAFER plan is to consider pregnant people who are incarcerated at Florence and McClure, as well as CCBC and our other local jail facilities across the state, and considering the fact that they may not be necessarily vulnerable as it turns out, or as it relates to COVID in terms of their medical needs, but to be thinking about pregnant people and the women who are incarcerated at Florence McClure and the things that we need to be doing on their behalf as well. I just haven't heard a lot about that population today. So I'm open to more discussion on it. I'm open to wrapping up, but I did think maybe we needed to take a step back given our context and what we've heard from Director Daniels about whether or not we really feel like, do we want to be proactive about trying to release individuals? And then if we have that decision made, where are sort of the release valves? And it certainly sounds like it's with the parole board and the governor in terms of those release mechanisms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Have you thought about as one of the release valves the pardons board, and whether that's something the pardons board is going to do what the pardons board does, but a large number of folks who would be released under something other than the statutes that we've identified during the course of this meeting, I think is largely going to have to come from that group. And it's potentially a cumbersome effort. I wonder if the commission should ask that be convened now, or is that something you think we should defer on?
It's my opinion that the sooner we get our stakeholders involved in the conversation to just sort of see our situation, I think, we need to discuss what entities exist to be able to legally release. I know that there are some other scholars out there who are starting to compile the different mechanisms and power that governors have in terms of commuting sentences and other areas for release. And again, I am not advocating that we do anything necessarily wholesale, but to just think about what areas we do have for release. And I'm of the opinion that we should take that proactive stance, but I'm certainly one commissioner and would want to make sure that we have consensus on that from the commissioners.
So let me ask again, I'll canvass the commissioners to react to Dr. Salisbury's observations and see whether or not there's an appetite among commission members to urge for release of inmates. But it's not a wholesale release. It's starting to address a plan of release of individuals and what that plan consists of would be further debated by the Sentencing Commission. And that, do I correctly characterize what you were saying, Dr. Salisbury?
Absolutely, not a wholesale, but just that we continue the discussion and the debate, because I think it's a moot point if we don't have consensus to take this proactive approach. It makes sense to me to have that solidified. Okay. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Tyler Garner, do you have any comments, observations? Again, no one's committing to a vote. It's really just kind of a canvas to see if there's a general interest in pursuing this subject matter further.
I would love to pursue it further. I want to note I'm pleased to see that a number of the recommendations in the report are already occurring, and believe as it relates to the compassionate release or the implications around early release and supports in the community, that we should do our due diligence to ensure that if we are going to support that approach, that there's a divine process in place that ensures cross-agency coordination. But as it relates to some of the other practices, including even ensuring the calls and things of that nature with family, I'm pleased to see that much of that is already underway, and that where there is a need to ensure a safety net for some of the vulnerable populations, that we do our due diligence there if we're going to support that effort.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Story?
The answer is yes. I would like us to look at this option and ultimately be able to just make a recommendation to the Pardons Board. One question that I have, at least for me, be helpful is what number are we looking at? Who would provide that number? I'm guessing it's the Department of Corrections, and what standard would that number be based on? How many people are eligible for compassionate release? But then also within the jails, as Dr. Salisbury was referring.
So I don't have the answer, but I do want to offer this comment, Mr. Story. The commission and members of the commission can certainly offer suggestions about this topic, but at the end of the day, to the extent that we're dealing with people incarcerated in the Nevada Department of Corrections who are seeking early releases, the category of defendants or inmates that would be considered are going to be determined, I think, by the Pardons Board. They're going to assess this. Now, I'm sure that the Pardons Board would welcome input from this commission to categorize people. Hate to use it that way, but to create categories or identify. But I think the commission needs to offer suggestions and ideas about who might be considered. You saw from the ACLU letter that they started with the category of people that were mentioned in Chief Carpenter's comments. Those for whom parole has already been granted, but there's some impediment, either on the part of their conditions or some conditions that perhaps could be waived,